You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, and happy Christmas Eve 2022. Again, I know I don't usually release episodes midweek, but back around Thanksgiving, I released an episode. I think actually it came out on Thanksgiving about the war in Ukraine, and it was a chance for me to address an issue that I wanted to talk about for a while, but really couldn't make it a full-length episode. And so I have this idea going forward that whenever there's a holiday or some sort of special event, I might drop an extra episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. It won't be as long as my regular episodes, but it'll allow me to deal with some topics that I don't usually get to cover on the show because it just won't fill an entire episode of a podcast. So I know that we are going into Christmas season, and if I had to guess, you are going to receive at least one Amazon gift card during this holiday season, at least one, which means that you'll probably have at minimum $25. And if you're the kind of person that likes to listen to a show like the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, you probably have a list of books that you are interested in reading. And so what I wanted to do on the episode today is talk about 6 books that really shape my political thinking and my theology of politics. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and break down some of the books that have been the most influential to me or that have really stood out to me in terms of trying to think either about the relationship between my Christian faith and my political commitments and my political understanding, and just my understanding of how politics and society work in general. So we're going to break this up into 2 sets of 3. So the first 3 books that we're going to take a look at today are books that I actually read several years ago when I first started thinking about politics systematically for the first time. And I think all 3 of these books I read either when I was in college or when I was in ministry. So, it was over a decade ago. These books are not that old. They all came out, I think, in the late 2000s. But they've been out for a couple of years, but they really helped shape my thinking at a time when I had not thought about politics in a systematic sort of way. And all 3 of the first set of books that I am going to explain on the show today were written by Christian scholars about specific biblical and theological issues. And then the second set of 3 are books that I've read more recently. And these are the 3 books that really helped me to better understand my libertarian politics and the way that I view the world from a libertarian perspective. And so I wanted to give you guys an opportunity, if you get that Amazon gift card or if you just want to buy yourself a nice new book to read, I would highly recommend checking out all 6 of these books because all of them intersect with what we discuss on the show today. So we're going to go ahead and just get started, and I'm going to explain why these books are so important and why I think you should buy yourself a copy of all of these books. So the first 3 books, as I said before, are written by Christian scholars and deal with biblical or theological issues. So the first one that I want to talk about is a book that's written by a biblical scholar named Mike Bird, and it is called Are You the One Who Is to Come? And Mike Bird is a teacher at Ridley College in Australia. He's written a ton of books, a great scholar, one of my all-time favorites. And in fact, Mike Bird was a scholar that I was introduced to, I think, my second year of college when I took my Introduction to Paul class. He has a very small book called Introducing Paul that we read in that class that was very helpful, informative to me. And Michael Bird is really interesting because on a recent episode of the Libertarian Christian Institute's podcast, the LCI has a bunch of podcasts, but their flagship one is just called the Libertarian Christian Institute. Mike Bird was talking about a book that he wrote, a really good book, and I can't remember what the title of it is, but I think it's called Faith in a Secular Age or something along those lines. And he was talking about it, and he said on the show that he very well might eventually wind up considering himself a libertarian. So Mike Bird is someone who definitely shares a political worldview that is very similar to mine and probably very similar to yours as well. So this book called Are You the One Who Is to Come? It addresses Jesus's messianic identity. So it's a detailed study, an exegetical study, an interpretive study of the Gospels. And this book is going to address the messianic identity of Jesus. And so Bird articulates this problem that in the Gospels, Jesus does not directly refer to himself as the Messiah, but throughout the early church, if you read all of the letters that were written by Paul and all of the other writers of the works that would eventually be included within the New Testament, everyone unanimously understands Jesus to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. So how do you square the fact that Jesus' messiahship is all over the Gospels and all over the writings of the early church with the fact that Jesus doesn't ever refer to himself as the Messiah using that language? And so Bird is going to argue in this book that Jesus acted in ways that would have been understood by his contemporary audience as messianic. And you have to remember that Jesus is a Jew who lives within a Jewish context. And so within Second Temple Judaism, there was a set of expectations about the promised Messiah and about how that Messiah would deliver the people of God, Israel, from their corporate sins as a nation, and that he would restore them and bring about the end of the age, which was not the end of the space-time universe, but rather the completion of God's plan for humanity through his people. And the Messiah in several different strands of Second Temple Judaism was going to be the figure that would bring that about. And so Michael Bird says that Jesus acts in ways that would have been understood as messianic, and that in Jesus' words and deeds, he demonstrates himself to be the Messiah. And so Jesus, even though he doesn't necessarily use the language of Christ to refer to himself directly, he very much acts in a way that we can historically reconstruct as being messianic. And so Jesus would have understood himself as a messianic figure, as all of his earliest followers do, and as the Gospels attest that all of his earliest followers do. And so Bird is also going to argue that Jesus' own sense of a messianic vocation, Jesus' own sense that he is the Messiah that is called to bring about the restoration of the people of God, is going to be the foundation for the proclamation of Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah in the early church. And so this book is a really great overview of not only Jesus' messianic self-identity and the way that worked itself out in his ministry and in the early church, but it's also a really good overview of how messianic thought in general works within Second Temple Judaism, and it really helped me think about the meaning of Jesus' messianic identity. And I remember reading this book after having read a lot of other works on gospel scholarship, and Mike Bird is able to bring a lot of kind of disparate threads that appear in various books on the historical Jesus together to think about what it meant for Jesus to act and live in messianic sorts of ways. So Are You the One Who Is to Come by Mike Bird, who may just be a libertarian like us, is my first book recommendation, and I would highly recommend you pick up a copy of it. The second one that I would like to recommend, written by a Christian scholar, is a book that is by Scott McKnight. And Scott McKnight is another amazing New Testament scholar. He teaches at Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in Illinois, and his book is called The King Jesus Gospel. And this was a really eye-opening book for me. It's very similar to the work of N.T. Wright. If you have read any of N.T. Wright's work, which I would highly recommend, a lot of what he has written as well. N.T. Wright's a very talented scholar, but it builds on a lot of the ideas that N.T. Wright has in his own work. And so McKnight, the thesis of the book is that he's going to grapple with what the definition of the term gospel actually is. So we throw around this word gospel all the time, but very few people stop to define it. So his whole argument is based on this idea that we have fundamentally misunderstood what the word gospel means. And so he makes the claim, and it's definitely true, that in Protestant circles, at least since the Reformation, or I guess exclusively since the Reformation, since Protestantism as such did not exist before the Reformation, he's going to argue that after the Reformation, people began to equate the term gospel with salvation. And so when people talk about the gospel, what they hear is a message about how an individual can get right with God, about how an individual can be saved before God. And McKnight says that that's not what the word gospel actually means. It's not a message that is about personal salvation or how an individual can make things right with God. And instead, he bases his book on an interpretation of 1 Corinthians 15. And in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul actually defines what the term gospel means. And in that definition of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about how Jesus is the Messiah according to Israel's scriptures, and that this was demonstrated through his death and resurrection. And what Scott McKnight does a really good job of doing doing in this book is he describes how the gospel, the good news, is the message of how Jesus is the Davidic king. He is the Messiah that was promised to David and promised in the prophets in the Old Testament, and that he fulfills the entire story of the Old Testament through his death and resurrection, that the story of the Old Testament and the restoration of the people of God come about through Jesus's faithful death and resurrection as the Messiah. So it very much follows up on a lot of the historical ideas that Michael Bird draws on in his book, Are You the One Who Is to Come? And Scott McKnight will go on to explain how Jesus's identity as the Messiah is the fulfillment of the Old Testament story, and that is what the word gospel means. Gospel, euangelion in Greek, means good news, and it is the good news that Jesus is the crucified and risen Messiah in fulfillment of the Old Testament. And while that ultimately results in the salvation of those that have faith in him or who are obedient to the faithfulness of Jesus, that is not the gospel itself. One of the great things about this book, and the title is very obvious, is that the proclamation of the gospel must include the message that Jesus is the one and only true king, and that we, the church, are the people of that king. And so it really does, and even though he at the very end of the book, he deals a little bit with the political ramifications of the King Jesus gospel. But what's really great about it is that if you step back and look at the way that his thesis works, if the gospel is about Jesus being the king, then that has to reorient our political commitments as Christians. And I remember reading this book about a decade ago, and this was one that I didn't know anything about libertarianism at the time, but this was definitely one of those books that made me more skeptical about political power and about the way that people often identify themselves with political parties, and the way that many Christians put their hope in certain politicians to bring about the kingdom of God, or so they think that these politicians are going to bring about their interpretation of the kingdom of God. And this book, The King Jesus Gospel, is a rejection of that and an attempt to get back to an original first century understanding of the gospel as being a message about Jesus as king. That was a really, really good one for me. And then I think maybe the most influential book that I read on faith and politics during that time of my life was a book called The Politics of Witness by a scholar named Alan Bevere. And he is retired now, I believe, based on his Twitter profile. But he was both a pastor and a scholar, and I think Scott McKnight was as well. So he worked in a church, but he was also a scholar as well. And he wrote this little book, The Politics of Witness. I think I bought it in 2011, so it came out 2010, 2011, somewhere in that time frame. And he follows up again on a lot of the ideas that are in the book by Bird and the book by Scott McKnight. So he argues in the book that we, the people of God, are the true church, that we are the eschatological or the messianic Israel, and that it is our responsibility as the church to bring about the reign of the kingdom of God here on earth. And so he starts out with this explanation about how Jesus is the king. He is the Davidic Messiah. All of those who have faith in the Messiah are his people, and it is our responsibility to bring about the rule or the reign of the Messiah here in the world. And he is going to address both the problems of Constantinianism and Christendom. Constantinianism is the attempt of the church to wield political power, and Christendom is when the society reflects Christian values through the force of the government. And he explains how, very eloquently in this short book, the message of the church is compromised when the church attempts to acquire and express itself in terms of political power. And he is very skeptical of the church's ability to wield and effectively use political power to the point where he says that it's almost idolatrous for Christians to try to gain control of political systems in order to force their faith on other people. He is going to very openly criticize both conservative and progressive interpretations of Christianity. And while he argues at the end of the book that the church should be politically engaged, the church should be politically engaged by being a witness to the reality of the kingdom of God and the king that is on the throne, which is Jesus. And so the way that the church should exercise its political will is not through violence, not through force, not through trying to co-opt the power of the government to meet our ends, but by testifying and witnessing to the messiahship of Jesus. That if the church actually, without trying to grasp for power, just presents the gospel to the world, then the church is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. This book is great. It's only like 80 pages long or 90 pages long, so you could buy this book and read it over the course of an afternoon. I'm going to highly recommend recommend it. So again, the three books that I'm going to recommend on the relationship between the Bible, faith, and politics are You the One Who Is to Come by Mike Bird, The King Jesus Gospel by Scott McKnight, and The Politics of Witness by Alan Bevere. Just as a side note, I reread the book, The Politics of Witness, over the summer, and I actually wrote a script up for that book in order to do an episode of it on this show, but I'm thinking that I might try to get Alan Bevere on the show, and if I can't do that because he doesn't have the time, then I will definitely go ahead sometime in the next couple of months and have an episode on that book. I think it's just that important. Definitely a big one for me, and again, these books all really helped shape my understanding of politics, and they were what developed my skepticism towards political systems in general. So, like I said, I read these books, a decade or more ago, and so it's been a long time since I have been engaged in, I guess, a more critical or more apprehensive or more uncomfortable view of politics in general. And so, for several years, I considered myself to be an independent and really non-political for the reasons that I outlined above. Like, these are some of the books that really helped me be skeptical about the use of human power. But for many, many years, I almost exclusively read books on biblical studies. And then when I became a teacher in 2017, I started reading a lot of books on ancient history and on world history. And so for several years, that was the majority of what I read as well. But in 2000, I really wanted to start thinking about politics in a more nuanced, from a more nuanced perspective. And I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, and I had found Reason Magazine at that point. And so I remember in the summer of 2020, I got on Amazon and I bought a couple of books on economics and on politics because I was really getting into economics at that time and really becoming more interested in economics. And so I want to go over three books that I've read within the last 2 years that have really helped me to become more of an articulated libertarian. Like, these are the books that really help convert me to a hardcore libertarian position on politics. So this next set of three books are going to be the books that took me from being someone that considered themselves a libertarian but not really having the philosophical or economic knowledge to back up that claim, to being a fully committed, intellectually driven libertarian, to have be a philosophical libertarian in the truest sense of the term. So the first of these books that I want to talk about, this is really important to me. It's by Thomas Sowell, and if you listen to this show, you probably know who Thomas Sowell is. He is not an Austrian economist, but he's still an economist and a social critic. Very brilliant guy, has a long and prolific history, taught at Stanford University for a really long time. He's written a ton of great books, and he is known for his empirical and statistical driven approach to social and economic problems. And one of the great things about reading Thomas Sowell's book is not only is he an incredibly quotable writer, he has a ton of great anecdotes, and he just a very good way. He has a lot of very good ways of putting things. He's a very memorable writer, but his writing is incredibly focused on statistics, and he's able to use statistics to eliminate a lot of really bad arguments and really bad thinking about economics. And so I think kind of the crowning jewel of Thomas Sowell's work, at least from my perspective, is a book called Economic Facts and Fallacies. And I read this book in the summer of 2020. And at this point, I was already very much committed to free markets and limited government. And I think going into 2020 thought that there might be a certain place for some economic intervention by the government in certain situations. Like I believe that to a limited extent going into 2020. But I read Economic Facts and Fallacies, and what Sowell is going to do is he's going to look at all of the failures, all of the fallacies of approaches to economics that are often held by thought leaders and intellectuals. And so he deals with all of the kind of theoretical fallacies of popular approaches to economics. And then he is just going to offer a devastating, statistically detailed critique of all economic interventions and all conventional economic wisdom. So his, in the first chapter of the book, he outlines various economic fallacies that people hold to. And one of the biggest critiques that he makes is the almost inability for people to see the second or third or fourth or fifth order effects of economic controls, that whenever the government comes in and tries to control a certain aspect of the economy, it might solve one very small particular problem, but it creates these ripple effects throughout the economy, and it winds up creating a whole host of other unanticipated problems. And when people think about economic intervention, they generally think about the problem that is being solved directly without thinking about all of the consequences that are going to result from the economic intervention. And Thomas Sowell does a great job of showing in his book how these interventions have just wreaked havoc on all aspects of our society. And so he is going to present throughout the several chapters in this book just a devastating statistical critique of popular assumptions regarding the economics behind gender, race, urban centers, the third world, academia, and all kinds of other issues. And this is a brutal, empirical, and darn near irrefutable book. Like, Thomas Sowell's arguments are so airtight, and I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people that are economically progressive don't want to deal with Thomas Sowell as an intellectual, because his work is just so solid and airtight. And he demonstrates through statistics that not only is the conventional wisdom surrounding economic activity and economic intervention almost entirely wrong based on the empirical data that we have, but it also proves that almost every attempt to control or direct the economy are all doomed to failure, and that interpreters of economic history often work within fallacious theories of economics that ignore the relevant evidence that Thomas Sowell is going to present in this book. So if you're someone that is not 100% sold on free market economics, you have to read Economic Facts and Fallacies. It is one of those books that will forever change your opinion about the way that economics works. And again, I know for you people that have been involved in libertarianism for a while that Thomas Sowell is not Murray Rothbard or Friedrich Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, but Thomas Sowell is an incredibly brilliant economist, and this is still to this day probably my personal favorite book on economics that I've ever read. And it was a big game changer for me. And again, I read that in the summer of 2020. And then I believe it was either in December of 2020 or January of 2021, I picked up a copy of The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, which is going to be my second book recommendation for this set of books today. And those of you guys that have been in the libertarian movement for a while, you will not be unfamiliar with The Road to Serfdom. But Friedrich Hayek is a great Austrian economist, and he wrote this legendary book called The Road to Serfdom, which is kind of the definitive critique of all authoritarian governments. And The Road to Serfdom was first published in 1944, obviously towards the end of World War II, and it was written against both fascism and communism. And this is just the best possible takedown that somebody could have written on authoritarian government in general. And so he is going to talk about not only the complete and utter failure of fascism and communism and the way that these regimes were able to prop themselves up, but he also is worried about the ways in which at the time he saw governments in the governments of England and the governments of the United States, supposedly democratic regimes, often utilizing the same social and economic controls that were put into place by the Soviets and the Nazis. And of course, the goal of The Road to Serfdom, the title at least, is that when you start implementing those kind of political and economic controls, that your government, your country can only head in one direction, and it is not a good direction. So he's going to talk about utopian thinking and central planning, and about how both of those are unworkable because human beings are deeply subjective, and that there's no possible way for a single person or organization to possibly have enough data to make efficient decisions that impact all people equally. And he deals with the irrationality of trying to control an economy from the top down, and with the irrationality of trying to control human behavior from top down. He just doesn't think it's possible because of the limits of human knowledge. And he has several chapters in this book where he demonstrates both empirically and philosophically how authoritarian controls, how top-down government don't work. And he's going to argue throughout for less and less authoritarianism from the top. He's also going to look philosophically at how governments manipulate language and statistics to present state-friendly interpretations of the truth. And also, he has a really powerful chapter in the book called Why the Worst Always Get on Top. And he talks in this chapter about how the incentives of power, if you create a society where there are leaders that get an inordinate amount of power, it creates an incentive structure that almost inevitably wind up with those that want power to control other people in charge. And so the way that power works when it is centralized almost inevitably winds up with authoritarianism or authoritarian type leaders. Now, I read this book in the middle of the first COVID winter, and so you can only imagine the deep relevance of everything that Friedrich Hayek Hayek said in that work. And if you have not read The Road to Serfdom yet, it'd be really interesting to read it with all of the echoes of a post-COVID world in mind. And so I would recommend it. I'm going to put a link to the version that I have in the show notes. The version that I have has some extra essays by Friedrich Hayek at the end that are really helpful and kind of flesh out some of his arguments in The Road to Serfdom. But that one was really powerful for me, and it basically ended any sort of illusion that I ever had that central government planning was a good thing. So not only had Thomas Sowell demonstrated just a couple months before I read that in Economic Facts and Fallacies that economic controls don't work, but the very basis for authoritarianism and the very basis for strong central governments is undermined by Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And then the third book that I want to discuss, the third of this set, is a book that you absolutely, if you have not read this, you have to read it. It is so important. And it is the book is called Enough Already, and it is written by the great Scott Horton of the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, just an incredibly powerful and intelligent anti-war activist. And this book was published in early 2021. And at this point, I had read The Road to Serfdom, I had read Economic Facts and Fallacies, and I knew almost nothing on America's terror wars overseas. And so I got on my computer, I think one day at lunch in January, and I saw an article on Reason Magazine about the wars, and I was like, I wonder if there's a book about the war on terror. And Scott Horton had just released this book, and so I immediately bought it and I read it. And this is just an incredibly good, definitive history of the United States war on terror in the Middle East. And like Sowell's book, this book challenges the conventional wisdom of the terror wars, and it's going to find that the terror wars are not rooted in the events that took place on September 11, 2001, but that the terror wars are really rooted in events that took place around the globe in 1979. And this book is going to be a very long, detailed story of government corruption and incompetence, and it shows that the U.S. response to conflicts in the Middle East have done nothing but fuel more conflicts and made the world objectively less safe than before. So again, reading this book along with Hayek and Sowell just completely dissuaded me from the notion that our government officials were ignorant in the war on terror, and but well-meaning. And this was really my final step that led to my libertarian understanding of politics, because up to this point, I kind of had this assumption that government officials might really have our best interest in mind, but they just, again, like Hayek's approach is that they just couldn't possibly have the knowledge to make good decisions. And so while they're well-meaning, they're just going to be ignorant, and they're not going to be able to wisely rule from the top. After reading Enough Already, I'm very cynical about the motives of many people that wind up in power. And this is going to be just an incredibly powerful look, not only at the war on terror, and it's a great, detailed, empirically driven history, but if you extrapolate from that the principles of government that are in Hayek's book as well, then you're going to come away with a lot of skepticism towards the government and all of the lies that they tell us to justify their economic and political programs. So those were the three books that really turned me on to libertarianism. So I am glad that I had an opportunity to share these with you guys today. I'm glad I gave you a little introduction. Again, if you only have $25 to Amazon and you can only buy one, I would highly recommend, again, one of these 6 books. All of them are going to be really great. And so if you are a Christian and you are a libertarian, again, the first 3 books, you don't even have to be a Protestant to enjoy the first 3 books. They're written just to a Christian audience in general. So if you're Catholic or Orthodox, those books are going to have an equal amount of meaning to you as they did to me. If you want to think through the Christian libertarian perspective on the world, these 6 books are well worth the price. I would highly recommend them, and I think that you should get on Amazon and you should spend a little bit of money on these books. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to the end. I'm excited that I got to share these very important books with you today. I hope that they inspire you to read, and I hope that 2023 is a year of much learning and thinking for you. Thank you so much, and I will see you on Tuesday. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.